When it comes to year 11 and 12 crafting texts, there's two aspects of the SAC, basically. In the exam, you just have to write a piece that's about whatever theme you've been given. So protest, play, personal journey. Or when it comes to the SAC, you not only have to write that piece, but you also have to write a statement of intention explaining how you wrote your piece and why. And there's a couple of key aspects that you need to put in it. I like to always think about a statement of intention as just an explanation of the decisions you made and then why you chose those decisions. And when it comes to crafting text, there are a couple of things or a couple of decisions you have to make and you have to refer to your choices for. So the first one is the purpose and the form of the piece. So, for example, are you writing a short story or a memoir, or are you writing a biography? Are you writing an opinion piece? All these things are different types of forms you could choose. The other thing you might choose to do is write with a particular purpose. In fact, I would recommend it because it's part of the criteria. And the purposes that you can write with, at least in year 12, are to argue, express, reflect, and explain. So you want to write with one of those in mind, or one or more, and you want to pick a particular form that you can use that will express this the best. So, for example, if you wanted to argue a particular idea that we should do something about whatever topic you've been given, probably the better form would be something like an opinion piece or an article. Whereas if you are more interested in reflecting on your experiences or expressing your thoughts, it'd be better to pick maybe a blog post, or it'd be better perhaps to pick a personal essay. The next thing you have to do in a statement of intention is reflect on your audience and context. So not only are you going to be writing with a particular aim in a particular style, but you're writing to a particular audience in a particular time. So the easiest way to think of this is generally with a speech. If you're writing a speech, you want to be really deliberate about who it's aimed towards. So you want to make sure if you're, for example, presenting in front of Parliament to an audience of politicians, that you really pick language which is going to resonate with them and you want to directly speak to them. So perhaps you might say something like, it's important that people such as you with this power over parliamentary decisions are given the information needed to make this kind of legislative change. That's something you would say only to an audience of parliament members. You wouldn't say that to an audience, say, of protesters who are ready to go out and start championing your cause. The other thing is the context. Is it a really formal context you're writing in, or is it a very casual one? Depending on who your audience is, you'll want to change your language as well. These are the 4 kind of basic things you really have to have worked out before you write your piece, because unless you know who you're writing for and what you're writing about, there's no real reason to get started. But once you've got them, you're kind of ready to go. And the next thing you have to work out is the ideas, so the content that you're going to talk about. So there's 2 things that should go into your content in year 11 and 12. The first one is the mentor texts you're given. So you'll be given some short stories, which most of you have probably read through at this point. Short stories, articles, opinion pieces, reflective articles. And ideally, you're going to kind of use these as the basis of your own writing. So the reason these are picked by a VCAR or your teachers is that they're supposed to be exemplar examples of things like form, genre, voice, and so on. It's kind of really hard to get too much exemplar work with only 4 mentor texts, but that's all right. And the other place you'll get your ideas from is the title and stimulus. So how you get all these ideas, how you choose your purpose, form, audience, and context, these all make up your writing process and ultimately your authorial choices. And you'll have to go through each of these in turn, explain why you picked, or what you picked first of all, and then why you picked it. So I like to think of this almost as like an argument analysis of your own piece. So we will continue on. What order should you go through all these things in your statement of intention? I like to break a statement of intention up into three main categories. The first one is the introduction. So this should basically be all this stuff up here, all the stuff you need to know before you get writing: purpose, form, audience, context. You want to get that out of the way early because this applies to your piece as a whole. And then the next two sections of your statement of intention should be about the writing and drafting process, and then your authorial choices. So we'll go through this one to start with. Your introduction should be your overall purpose of the piece, so this thing up here, a brief summary of your main ideas or arguments, and anything else that relates to the piece as a whole, so form, audience, context. So I like to start with the overall purpose or the aim of the piece, because I think the aim is really what sets the tone for the piece as a whole. So remember, our purposes are to express, reflect, explain, argue, or any combination of those. I might say something like, in this piece, I wanted to focus on reflecting, explaining, arguing, whatever idea I have about my framework of ideas. So I've got here an example for protest. I might want to say, I wanted to reflect on the value of protest for giving voice to underrepresented groups. See how that's like a niche idea about protest? It's not just protest generally, but it's a sub-idea about it. Or you could say, if you're doing a piece on personal journey, I wanted to focus on expressing and reflecting on my own personal journey of migration from one country to another. This is a really good way to start. Once you've done that, it's good to go over your themes and ideas and whether or not these are similar or different from the mentor texts, which should have inspired some of your ideas. So generally, it's good to take an approach where you pick something that you did that's kind of similar to a mentor text, and then you say what you did that's similar to them, and then how you built on it or how you changed it, because you don't want to exactly copy what that person did. You want to have your own unique take on it. So you might say, for example, like Shakespeare, I chose to explore the idea of problems with jealousy. However, I focused less on how people are jealous in relationships and more on the jealousy between women in a career context, say. Or if you were doing something more specifically for personal journey, the author who wrote the Red Chair piece, I chose to explore the idea of family and symbolic items in family connection. However, I focused less on how an item can link us to a previous country and more on how an item can represent an individual relationship. So that's an example of how you could deal with the themes and ideas. Three more things to put in the introduction. I would briefly refer to context. So especially if you're writing a fictional speech where you're some made-up persona presenting to Parliament or presenting to an audience of protesters, you would have to refer to why you decided to do that fictional persona and that fictional context. So you might say, for example, I chose to set my piece in the context of a protest, or I chose to set my piece just prior to a women's rights protest because I wanted to explore the psychology of a protester before they start protesting. Or if you're just writing from your personal context, you don't have a fictional persona, you might just want to say, I chose to write from my personal context, in which maybe refer to some things that have happened recently. So in which there is a lot of global conflict currently, because I felt that the current national and international conflict made me reflect on the value of protest for, and then whatever your message is, perhaps protest as a way to assert human rights. If you're writing in a particular form, say a speech, a short story, a blog post, it's really good to quickly refer to why you did that as well, because the form informs the whole piece that's going to come. So I would say, additionally, I wrote my piece as a speech, a blog post, a memoir, because I felt that it was best for. And as I say here, always make sure to link this back to your purpose. So your form has to be picked to match your purpose. If your purpose is to argue, a form, as we said earlier, that would work well would be a speech or an oral presentation of some kind, or maybe an opinion piece. Whereas if your intention, your purpose is to express or reflect on ideas, it might be better to have a memoir, a biography, or a short story. So whenever you're saying what you thought your form was best for, link it to the purpose. Finally, I would reference my audience here. So is this directed to a particular group of people? If so, I would go into why you picked that group of people and try to have one if you can in your SAC piece, because this gives you a little bit more to talk about. And then you can wrap your introduction up with ultimately recapping what the intention behind this piece was. So my intention with this piece was to express how protest, personal journey, play is able to, whatever you think the benefit is, help you let go and reconnect with your true self. So that's the structure of how I would write the introduction to a statement of intention. This is the first set of things I would deal with, and it kind of covers the first half of your piece. Next thing we have to do is talk about the writing process, which goes over the title and stimulus, the mentor text a little bit more, and then authorial choices. So after you've gone over the stuff that applies to the piece as a whole, it's good to briefly have a couple of lines talking about your drafting process. So I would talk about what your initial thoughts were when you first saw the stimulus and the title. And I would say something along the lines of, I was inspired by whatever stimulus it was because of how it encapsulated the idea of how we create ourselves and our identity rather than finding it. Or you might say, I also needed to relate my piece to the title Duty Calls, which centered around this idea of a duty to protest, or which was closely related to the same idea as whatever stimulus you just referred to. So talk about the ideas that come from the stimulus and title, then also talk about any thoughts that came from the mentor texts. There's some example sentences you can use here. And if you've got a little bit of space and a little bit of time, you might also want to talk about how you developed the piece. So any times you went to your teacher, got feedback on the drafts, any times you decided to make major structural changes, I would mention that as well. So the writing and drafting process is a pretty brief paragraph. There's not too much you need to go into. But the authorial choices paragraph is a lot bigger, and this is probably going to be the meat of your response. This last paragraph, I often split into 2 paragraphs because it gets quite meaty. Ideally, though, the structure you use is pretty simple. It's very much like what you would do for an argument analysis. You're just doing an argument analysis of your own writing, and it's not necessarily going to be an argumentative piece. Basically, what you want to do is say, what did you do? If possible, quote it. So if it's a particular word choice, quote it. If it's relevantly similar to one of the mentor texts, you can talk about that as well. But the most important thing is to say why. And when you talk about why you put it in, it should always refer back to this original purpose you picked, this message you're trying to convey to this particular audience. So let's go through a couple of examples. I like to do this process for all of each of the following. From what I've seen this year, most schools in their criteria for a statement of intention want people to comment on these things: text structures, language features, vocab, writing conventions, voice, and tone. So if you do 1 to 2 sentences on each of these, depending on what your word limit is for the statement of intention, you should be pretty covered. So an example for text structure might be, I chose to structure my piece with a reflection at the beginning and end, similar to Mark Gillespie in his Friday essay. That should probably have quotes around it. In order to create a sense of circularity and completion to my piece. So why would you do something like that? Can't quote it because it's structural, but we can say that it's similar or different to this mentor text. We might also say similarly to Emmeline Pankhurst, so referring to the mentor text author that it's similar to. I adopted a passionate and frustrated tone in order to, okay, so that's what we did. And then what is the purpose? Embody your persona as a protester, for example, or a student looking for what to do in their life in order to express my disappointment with the issue of how career counselors help people at school, the state of women's safety, the state of the economy, etc. So that's an example of how you could talk about your authorial choices in voice and tone. And lastly, you might say, while many of the authors of the mentor texts relied on their lived experiences, I preferred to give examples of protests in other countries, such as the atrocities in Ukraine, so quoting the words that you chose in your piece, in order to, and then referring back to your purpose, give a sense of the global nature of the human experience. So these are just a couple of examples of how you can talk about what you did, quote it, say how it's similar or different from the mentor text, and then explain why. And as I said, I would do one of each of these for all of these authorial choices, 2 if you have to make up a bigger word count. Last thing to note for authorial choices is if you have picked a particular audience, such as politicians or protesters or students or the principal, you have to make sure that you analyze what word choices you used to connect to that audience specifically. So I might say, for example, I used high-level language choices and an appeal to pride in order to connect with my educated audience of politicians. So you might use fancy words and appeal to the pride of politicians if you're addressing them in an attempt to inspire them to pass the legislation that you want. So that's the last thing I would maybe talk about when it comes to authorial choices. So those are the 3 key things you want to go over. Overall purpose and main ideas of the piece. Anything that applies to the whole piece, purpose, context, form, audience. Then talk about your writing and drafting process. And lastly, go through the piece chronologically. Pick one of each of these: structural, language, vocab, tone, features. Write about what you did and why. And then at the end, I would just wrap up with 2 or 3 sentences about your overall aims, just recapping that initial purpose. So hopefully if you've got your SAC this week, this is a helpful overview of what you need to pop in that statement of intention. If you have questions about whether there's anything you can cut out, just let me know, because it does depend a little bit on schools. Some want a bit more emphasis in one area than the other. I had one school, for example, that wanted people to talk about the audience, not in the introduction, but in the writing process section.